I graduated in December and was drafted by April of 1967. So I was out of the picture. And while I was in the Army, I discovered how lucky I was. I had what I came to call strange luck that followed me all of my life. And I first noticed it when I was in the Army, because a lot of things happened in the Army that didn't normally happen to guys who were drafted. I was very, very, very lucky. There are millions of examples of guys who had abilities who were put into the Army, into jobs which did not pertain to their skills whatsoever. Your job was classified as MOS, method of service. And as the example, my dad told me his experience in World War II, when he went overseas with a couple of his Trenton buddies, one of which was a guy named Jimmy Schwartz, who had a very bad speech impediment, okay? Nice guy, but you could hardly understand what he was saying. So, of course, the Army made him a radio operator. So I was prepared to get an occupation in the service that did not correspond with my abilities. But strange luck. We were supposed to do something awful that day, like I was at Fort Benning in basic training, in Fort Benning, Georgia. And routinely they put us through things that would train us to be soldiers, one of which was going to be gassed. So we would go to a gas chamber where we would experience being gassed and putting on our gas masks and so forth. The day I was to do that, I went to be assigned my MOS, okay, instead. So, and I got to do things that other guys didn't do because I was a college graduate. And they always tried to get college graduates to go to OCS, Officers Candidate School, because they wanted skilled officers. But to me, I was drafted for 24 months. If you were an officer, you had to serve for 3 years, so that added another 12 months to my service. I would have none of that. The clerk who interviewed me for my MOS, wouldn't you know, he was an artist. He was a frustrated artist who was in the Army working as a clerk and was very unhappy with it. So when he found out that I was an artist, he gave me the MOS of illustrator. Of course, that didn't mean that the Army would assign me to be an illustrator, but anyways, it was a big step in the right direction. So after basic training, again, luck came into play. I was assigned to Fort Stewart, Georgia, which was near Savannah. It was a huge complex. It was 50 miles across. It was the very closest Army base I could possibly be to the state of Florida, okay? And my father got me a used car, and I was able to drive on my weekends or on passes down to see my family. And also I was dating a young lady at Florida State University. Her name was Rebecca, and I was also able to drive to Tallahassee from Fort Stewart. So it was during this time period that my courtship led to the woman that would be my partner for the rest of my life. Another reason for going to Tallahassee to see Rebecca was that the campus movies was running the Ghost of Zorro serial. And I had to see that again. So, of course, one of the things we did on our date was to go see the Ghost of Zorro. Again, this all went together to form my future career. Another amazing thing, while I was in basic training, of course, the drill sergeants had no use for an artist. But the guys I was in the barracks with, they thought it was neat that I could draw, and they would ask me to draw pictures of their girlfriends and all that, and I'd do that for like, I'd make $5 a drawing or something like that. Now, at the time, military pay was $75 a month. Well, you didn't need money, right? Because they clothed you in awful clothes, and they gave you room and board. Food was good, but you had to live in a barracks with like 20 other guys, so it wasn't terrific. But anyways, you didn't need more than $75. So I made a lot of extra money, and also there was a lot of competition in basic training between the different companies. And I was in a company that I was my drill sergeant. He must have had an IQ of about 40, and he could see nothing, no advantage to having an artist in his troop. However, the other companies did, and I was approached by not the captain of my company, but an opposing company, and he had me draw, and I have a photograph of it. I painted a thing for their mascot for their company. I don't think he paid me for it, but anyways, after basic training, I went home and then reported to Fort Stewart. The other amazing thing, besides this close locale to home, was that I was assigned to range patrol. And I got up with a guy there who was an artist. He was leaving the service, and I was to replace him. And he drew maps. Okay, that was art, drawing maps. But it wasn't what I would want to do, but it was certainly better than most other jobs. In the meantime, before he left, I would go out on the range patrol. Now, Fort Stewart was this vast training camp, and you would go down lines of tanks firing and cannons firing and all that. And the range patrol would like I said, it would patrol to see everything was functioning correctly and all that. And I would go with the sergeant, and I had a special range patrol helmet, which is like an MP helmet. But because I was an absolute buck private, I had not even a single chevron on my sleeve. A lot of people mistook me to be an officer, and I would go down the range patrol, and the guys would come up and salute me. So anyways, the guy whose job I was to take understood that I had abilities beyond what he could do and beyond what was needed to draw maps. So he took it upon himself to see Mr. King at the Fort Stewart training age. Said, I have this fellow here that could really be an asset to you because he can draw and he could do training aids, did graphics for whatever was needed for the entire post. The base was like a city, a small town unto itself, and it had everything that a regular city had, including a need for an artist. And my buddy there maneuvered me into that position, and Mr. King was a civilian, and he was a great blessing and really played into my strange luck. And I did cartoons and posters for events and all that happened on the post. I was there with two other civilians. I was the only actual military guy there, and I was being courted by a sergeant from Special Services who really wanted me to transfer to Special Services to do posters for the events that he put on, which were movies and whatnot, dances and things. And that appealed to me. I was drawing cartoons for the commanding officer. I believe it may or may not have been General Grambling at that time, but he wanted me to draw these bloody scenes of soldiers, wounded with their legs blown off and stuff like that, which I found very distasteful. Anyways, but Mr. King, again, this was unlike anybody else in the Army. He gave me the key to training aids so that I could come in after hours and on weekends to use a drawing board. And it was there that I drew samples that I would later send to Warren Publications to try to get employment drawing horror stories for Creepy and Eerie. And also because they had sort of copy machines there. I mean, it isn't like the machines that we have today, but there was ways and machines that I had at training aids that I could make duplicates on paper. And this was the place that gave birth to Paragon Publications. The very first publication I did was at night or on the weekends in training aids, where I had taken comic books, old comic books that I had gotten at McVicker's and the IW reprint stuff, and I put together a comic book. They had a machine that was miraculous. It was used to make transparencies for overhead projectors, which was a clear piece of plastic with a drawing on it that would be projected on a screen so the class could see it. You could take a full-color drawing, like a comic book page, and feed it through this machine, and it would off-print it onto a piece of plastic. But it only offset the black lines. It didn't reproduce any of the color. So this was the first method I discovered to drop color out of comic books. You then in turn took that color transparency and ran it through another machine which was charged with ammonia, stunk to high heaven, and it would offset that image onto a piece of paper. And that's how I printed Paragon Golden Age Greats, which was the first Paragon publication. It had many pages because I reprinted a lot of comic books. Again, stories of characters that no longer existed, like Eisner's The Spirit, Vigilante from Action Comics, Captain Marvel, which disappeared in 1953. And again, it was my interest in what had gone before that no longer existed today was borne out. And I did some original drawings and drawings also that were copied from other comic books, and I put together this book. Only printed 2 copies of it, but that was the beginning. I'd gotten to the point where I had asked Rebecca to marry me, and we had decided to get married after she graduated from grad school at Florida State. We'd be married in Jacksonville, and we had set the date, June. I better remember this. June 15th, 1968 was when we were to get married. Well, a couple of months before that, I came down through POR and Levy. I had gotten papers that I was to be shipped over to Germany a month before I was to get married. This was a crushing blow. And I lamented my situation to the guys in my barracks room. There were like 4 or 5 guys that we all roomed together in bunks in this one room. And this guy, I don't even remember his name, and I wasn't particularly friends with him, but he took pity on me, and he actually worked in POR and Levy. And so he took my transfer papers out of the file and dropped them down behind the filing cabinet. And as far as I know, they're still there to this day. So the sergeant at Special Services took advantage of this, and when it came time for me to sign out of training aids and go to Germany, he didn't take me to Germany. He took me to the other side of the base where I signed in and became an employee of training aids over there. And the guy whose job I was replacing took paintings that I had done at the place I was to work was a craft shop, and I had gone there to paint, and I had done paintings. He took my paintings while I was on my honeymoon to an art show in Savannah. And unbeknownst to me, when I came back, I had won the ribbon for Best in Mixed Media and Best in Show. I guess it was I won 2 things. Again, I didn't know anything about it. And also, he had this wonderful apartment, a loft apartment in downtown Hinesville that he bequeathed to me too. He was a very handsome guy, had a beautiful young wife, and he gifted me this. So, wow, I mean, Hinesville was not a very colorful place to live, and I was very lucky to find these accommodations. My new boss at the craft shop was John Gilmore, and he was a civilian who had come from Old Miss. I said, Old Miss? One of my high school buddies, Mike Dean, was at Old Miss as an art major. So you were an art major. Did you know Mike Dean? Oh, yeah, I knew Mike. Brother Rat. We bonded together. And long story short, I made a lot of movies while I was at the craft shop working with John Gilmore. He hired Rebecca as the secretary. I didn't report to duty until noon. And so I only stood, can't even remember it. Once a month we had to be in formation for roll call to make sure you were still there in the Army. I did that once a month where I had to go in at 5 o'clock in the morning. Otherwise, I got up around 10 o'clock and reported to work at noon, where I would work at night. And the craft shop was right across the street from the base theater. And this is one thing I did during my entire Army career. I never left Fort Stewart for the entire term of duty. And I went to the movies every time they changed, and they changed 3 times a week. I saw every movie that was ever released in 1967 and 1968 and 69. So that was amazing. And I taught photography and painting to the dependents, which was mostly the young housewives. Boy, rough job, huh? And also, John helped me make movies, and we made lots of movies there, utilizing my buddies in the Army. And also, we were able to buy equipment. And just before I was to leave, he said, what do you want to get next? And I said, well, I'm leaving. It doesn't matter. He said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, one thing I've always wanted to have is a printing press. So we went downtown Savannah, and John requisitioned the $3,000 A.B. Dick printing press. And this is where I printed the second Paragon publication, again, Paragon Golden Age Greats, where I had drawn at the craft shop and at training aids a 20-something page Captain Marvel story where I thought to myself, what if Captain Marvel, the Golden Age Captain Marvel, was brought back and was published by Marvel Comics? What if, like, Stan Lee was writing this, and he would awake from a coma, and he would be confronted by things that didn't exist in his day, like police brutality and hippies and the drug scene and all that. So I had a Captain Marvel that was angst-ridden, and he had a lot of problems, just like Spider-Man and other Marvel characters. So that's what I went with on that. And I printed the Paragon Golden Age Greats at Fort Stewart. Another Army buddy helped me run the press. Neither one of us had ever run a press before and had no working knowledge had no idea what we were doing. So the results of our efforts were less than stellar, but I did crank out, I guess, 100 or a couple hundred copies of the book. And then I finished my tour of duty, checked out with my CO. I only saw him twice. When I signed out of the Army, he asked me, he said, I don't suppose I could convince you to re-enlist. And I said, no, sir, I don't believe you can. And saluted, and off I went. And Rebecca and I packed up the car and went back to Florida. We moved to Castleberry, just north of Winter Park. Rebecca got a job down in South Orlando, and I got a job with a film production company. And while I was in the Army, I had been corresponding with Warren Publications, sending them samples of my work, and got up with editor Bill Parente. And Bill seemed to like my work, and he suggested that after I get out of the Army, I contact him, that he might have some work for me. I did, and he did, and then I started illustrating stories for CREEPY and EERIE. And this was a job that required me to both pencil and ink the stories. I would pencil the stories, mail it to New York, they'd have them lettered, send back to me, then I'd ink it. So the page rates were not very good, it was $35. If you read Bill Shelley's excellent book on the history of Warren Publications, you can learn all about this. It's really a wonderful job. It explained a lot of things in that book that I didn't understand when I was working for him. But the Warren stuff lasted, I guess, in 1969, and by that time I was working for a film production company in Orlando and making decent money there. The film production company didn't last but a few months, and we again were seeking employment. So Rebecca had contacted the School of Home and Interior Design at Florida State that she had a degree in, a master's degree, and they were thrilled that she was considering coming up there to be on the faculty, and so that's what we did. And the woman, Dr. Wheel, who was over Rebecca, lined me up with a job at the Florida State Media Center. So I was hired as an illustrator, and we bought a house well, we had an apartment, then bought a house, and bought another house. We were in Tallahassee for 8 years. And also in Tallahassee at that time, there was a lot of people in comic book fandom. Richard Small, who we called the Great Rich, actually taught a course at FSU in the nighttime on comic book collecting. So I was in good company up there, and some of them, like Steve Vance, he helped me with my Paragon stuff, and I would do illustrations for other guys' books as well. And also, the guys up there were really heavy into films, and I got up with Mike Ogden, who ran the films for Florida State, and he would schedule the films that would be shown on campus. And I talked him into renting a Durango Kid movie, and I got to see my first Durango Kid movie. I hadn't seen one since 1952, and this was 71 or 72. So that was a thrill. Anyways, Paragon continued while I was in Tallahassee, and it was a hit or miss proposition. I never had two nickels to rub together. I cut the expenses on doing it as best I could. I couldn't afford to have a whole book printed at one time, so I would have individual sheets, 11 by 17 printed front and back, and I'd print 1,000 or so of those until I had the whole book printed. Then I would collate them, fold them, and put the cover on, stitch, and trim them. So I did that with many of my earliest books, and that also I would go to the paper companies and get deals on paper stock. And I learned the place in Tallahassee, if I went around to the loading dock in the back, I could deal with a guy who actually loaded the paper on the trucks. And they had lots of paper that had been miscut and couldn't be sold to the people that ordered it. And they let me have this really on the cheap. In fact, a lot of times I was able to swap a case of beer for a case of paper. Boy, was that a great deal. So if you see the old Paragon books like Golden Age Greats, the first edition, it has all kinds of different paper stock in it, different colored paper and different weight paper. That's because I made all these deals with the paper companies to cut corners. And also at Florida State, we got an old used printing press and had that in the basement there, and I printed Femme Fantastique, the first issue of that there in the basement there. Later I got a hold of the press myself. I bought it, I guess, and had it in the basement of my home in Tallahassee and did some printing there. After leaving the media center, I went to work for a film production company, and he had an A.B. Dick like I had it in Fort Stewart there, and I printed an issue of Tara there. And eventually the book sold well enough that I could have the whole books printed at one time at a printer. I didn't have to do my own work. And that came to pass around 1977, 1978 when I left Tallahassee. I had gotten a lot of freelance work from the photographer who I had worked with at the film production company in Orlando. He had now started his own company where he was the boss, and he needed artwork, so he was sending me scripts, and I was doing artwork and mailing it down to Orlando. and he was sending me quite a volume of work. One day I got a letter from Roy Thomas, who had ordered my Paragon books and was aware of my artwork, asking if I would. He said, "Wasn't it time you started inking for Marvel?" So I thought, okay, I considered that, but I looked around the room and I had all these art flats laid out all over the family room. I mean, dozens and dozens of pieces. So I had so much work. It was 2 weeks before I was able to respond to Roy, and I started working for Marvel on a freelance basis with Roy as editor, and also I got a position. I was offered a position with my buddy Carlos in Orlando, Carlos James, with American Learning Systems, and they paid for my moving down to Winter Park, and we bought a house in Longwood and relocated there, and I continued doing the Paragon books, relocating in Orlando. The job with American Learning Systems was beautiful because Carlos didn't care what I did or how I did it, as long as it was good work and it was turned in on time. We had, of course, strict production schedules, and it turned out an incredible volume of films. But I would go to work around noon. I worked with a lady who lined up all the actors and locations, and I was hired as an artist, but like 2 or 3 days into the job, Carlos took me out in the field and showed me how he shot all the films. We shot everything on 35mm slides, and then they were converted to film strips. And we had a cartridge deal that had the film with a soundtrack on audio tape, magnetic tape synced to it, and it was these cartridge films that we did, and we did an enormous number of them, like 200 films a year. So the second day out, third day out, he takes me out and shows me how to shoot the Nikon, hands me the Nikon and says, okay, now you do it. So from that point on, I did all the photography and all the artwork for 200 films a year for several years at American Learning Systems. I was there from 78 to 82. And this offered me a lot of leeway to do Paragon books, because I didn't have to go to work until noon or afternoon, and I could work in the mornings and the nights on the Paragon stuff, and I was able to put out, I guess, 3 or 4 Paragons a year, and the circulation had really grown. Bud Plant was now distributing the stuff. There weren't really comic book distributors at that time, but I did well enough with them that I was able to take the money from one book, I think it was Star Films #2, to put in a swimming pool in my backyard so I could do something for my family. The independent comic book market had just started up in the late 70s, and there were a few titles out there, and comic book stores had opened up around the country, and they did not carry Marvel and DC comics that were newsstand only. And I'd not really given serious thought to going full-color professional with Paragon, but suddenly the rug was pulled out from under my feet when the corporate office decided to close down the film production end of the business. So I was given 1 week's notice that I didn't have a job and 2 weeks severance pay, and suddenly I had to figure out what to do with my life. I was bemoaning this fact to the local print shop guy in Longwood, and he said, "Why don't you, become a full-color printer, a comic book publisher?" And I said, "Well, all the comic books are published at World Color Press up north. I think it was in Michigan." And I couldn't do that. To get on with them, you had to have a minimum press run of 50,000 copies. So, but also at the same time, I was urged by David Scroggie, who headed Pacific Comics out in California, that I should make the leap from Paragon into the full color thing. So Chuck Yates, the guy at the local print shop, lined me up with a full color web press in Ocala, which is 80 miles north of Longwood. So we jumped into it, and we created AC Comics at the end of 1982. Also, by that time, this distribution did come into existence with Diamond and Capital City and Bud Plant and Phil Suling, Seagate. And there were 14 distributors in the early 1983. So I went into that full time, and that was a self-perpetuating business. You had 30 days to pay the printer, and you had 30 days to get paid from Diamond and the company. So you get the check from Diamond, and then you'd pay your printer and then move on to the next book. So that essentially was the end of Paragon, although all the characters that had a Paragon migrated into AC Comics, and the first AC Comics printed was Fun Comics number 4, which was a direct continuation of the series at Paragon. It was, the material was prepared for Paragon. I had it colored, and that's what launched the company. So that was the end of Paragon until 2014, when I retired from AC Comics and started Paragon up again, just for the fun of it. But we're here talking about Paragon and why I started Paragon and the reason I became an artist. And from listening to this babble, you can see that the reason I became an artist and started these companies was that I wanted to see the comic books and the comic book characters that had disappeared come back again, even if I had to draw them myself. So that's why I became an artist, and doing my own homegrown comics led to Paragon and led to AC Comics, and that's the story, and that's why I became an artist and why Paragon and AC Comics existed. So thank you for listening.